A German shepherd named Max walked into Silver Oaks nursing home with his handler, just like any other welfare check. But as they entered the communal lounge, Max suddenly froze in front of a tattered, mahogany-colored leather couch, his body going rigid like coiled steel, and a deep, mournful howl tore from his throat, shattering the sterile silence. No one understood why, until the cushions were torn apart, revealing handwritten letters and a tarnished locket. A stolen legacy had been buried in plain sight for a decade, and Max was the only one who refused to let it stay hidden. Are you ready to uncover the truth behind that howl? Silver Oaks didn't sprawl across manicured grounds, nor did it welcome visitors with grand marble columns. It sat hunched on the edge of the industrial district, where the evening sun cast long shadows through chain-link fences, and the scent of institutional bleach from the corridors competed with exhaust from the highway beyond each shift change. The gray brick building was flanked by neglected hedges, and its small square windows were hazed with years of grime, like the fading memories of those who lived within. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his patrol car with Max, a large male German shepherd, his coat the color of burnt amber and charcoal, ears scanning, and intelligent brown eyes already fixed on the double doors, as if he sensed something waiting inside. Beneath his canine vest, embroidered with the police department insignia, Max walked beside Daniel and measured confident strides, still carrying the alertness of countless narcotics busts and search and rescue operations that had defined their years of partnership. "Afternoon, Officer Brooks." A tired-looking orderly nodded from behind the reception desk, barely glancing up from his clipboard. "Another welfare check?" "Standard protocol," Daniel replied, his fingers unconsciously resting on Max's shoulders. "Is Dr. Wilkins available?" "He's in his office, probably reviewing charts. You know the drill. Just sign in and head back." Afternoon at Silver Oaks carried the hollow quiet of waiting. Elderly residents sat scattered throughout the communal lounge, a space floored with scuffed linoleum and lined with mismatched furniture that looked salvaged from estate sales. Some were watching a muted television, some sleeping with heads drooping in exhausted surrender, while others sat staring at nothing, accompanied only by the occasional hiss of the ancient radiator in the corner and the distant beep of a call button no one seemed to answer. Max had been to facilities like this before. He didn't seek attention, didn't pull toward the residents or wag for treats. He simply moved through the space with purpose, his nose working methodically, checking corners, pausing beside a wheelchair, moving on when Daniel gave the signal. People barely noticed Max, not because he wasn't impressive, but because at Silver Oaks, even a police dog felt like just another routine intrusion in their forgotten days. Daniel directed Max toward the medication room for the standard sweep, but today, just 3 steps into the lounge, Max stopped. No bark, no glance back for direction, just complete stillness. His body went rigid like a drawn bow, his eyes locked onto a single point in the room, a worn leather couch, mahogany-colored and cracked, positioned against the far wall beneath a dusty landscape painting. Daniel approached slowly, but Max didn't move. His head lowered, ears pinned flat against his skull. A low, guttural vibration rolled from deep within his chest, steady, insistent, like a siren buried beneath flesh and bone. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to vacuum the air from the room. The television voices faded into background static. A resident's hand paused mid-reach for a cup of water. Someone in a wheelchair turned slowly. "What's wrong with the dog?" a woman's voice called from across the room. Daniel crouched beside Max, his palm pressing against the dog's shoulder blade. He could feel the tremor rippling beneath the fur, involuntary, not trained. This wasn't the reaction to a hidden substance or the excited alert for food rewards. This was something primal, something that once led Max to missing children in abandoned buildings or to evidence buried where no one else thought to look. "Max," Daniel said quietly, but didn't pull the lead. He followed the dog's gaze, unwavering, locked onto the old couch. The leather was split along one armrest, the cushions sagging with years of weight. Beneath the frame, a small tear in the upholstery gaped open like a wound, as if someone had once hidden something inside and prayed no one would ever find it. Officer Lucas Reed arrived within minutes, his boots clicking against the linoleum with a kind of urgency that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He was young, maybe 26, with the pressed uniform and clean-shaven jaw of someone still trying to prove he belonged in the department. Daniel had requested backup not because he expected trouble, but because protocol demanded a second witness when a canine made an alert in a civilian facility. What he hadn't expected was Reed's barely concealed skepticism. "So, what have we got?" Reed asked, hooking his thumbs into his belt as he surveyed the lounge. His eyes skimmed over the residents, some watching with mild curiosity, others having already returned to their television programs and card games, before landing on Max, who hadn't moved an inch from his position in front of the couch. "Max alerted to that piece of furniture," Daniel said, keeping his voice level. "Strong indication there's something inside." Reed's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. He walked closer, circling the couch like he was inspecting a used car he had no intention of buying. "A couch? Brooks, with all due respect, we got called here for a wellness check on Mrs. Abernathy in room 214. This is a nursing home, not a drug den." "I understand that." "Do you?" Reed crouched down, peering under the furniture. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your dog's interested in a piece of nursing home furniture that probably smells like 50 years of spilled soup and old person smell. No offense to anyone," he added, glancing apologetically at a nearby resident who didn't seem to have heard him. Daniel felt the familiar tightness in his jaw that came with having to justify Max's instincts to someone who'd never worked with a canine. "Max doesn't alert to soup, Reed. He's trained for narcotics, explosives, and human remains. If he's this fixated, there's a reason. Or maybe he's just getting old." Reed stood, brushing off his knees. "How long have you two been partnered? 5 years? 6? Dogs lose their edge, man. It happens." The words landed like a slap, but Daniel kept his expression neutral. Max was 7 years old, prime years for a working dog, and his track record spoke for itself. 43 successful narcotics busts, 12 missing persons located, and 1 explosive device found in a high school locker that had saved countless lives. But Reed had been there for any of that. Reed had been finishing his criminal justice degree, while Max was doing the real work. "He hasn't lost anything," Daniel said quietly. Reed sighed, the sound carrying the weight of forced patience. "Look, I get it. You trust your partner. That's great. But we can't just start tearing apart furniture in a nursing home because a dog is sniffing around. You know how much paperwork that would generate, not to mention the lawsuit if we damage property and find nothing." "Then we get permission." "From who? The administrator? You really want to walk into Dr. Wilkins' office and tell him we need to dismantle furniture because your German Shepherd is having a moment?" Before Daniel could respond, a sharp voice cut through the lounge. "Is there a problem, officers?" Dr. Thomas Wilkins materialized from the hallway with the kind of smooth authority that came from years of managing a facility where questions were discouraged. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, and wearing the type of expensive cardigan that suggested he saw himself as more than just a nursing home director. His smile was professionally warm, but his eyes were doing calculations. "No problem, doctor," Reed said quickly, stepping forward with the kind of deference that made Daniel's teeth ache. "Actually, my canine has indicated potential evidence in that couch. I'd like permission to inspect it." Wilkins' smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind it. "Evidence? Officer Brooks, I assure you, that furniture has been here for over a decade. It's scheduled for replacement next month, but I hardly think it contains anything worth a police investigation." "Nevertheless, it's probably just food residue," Wilkins continued smoothly. Residents sometimes hide snacks. It's a common issue with dementia patients. I'm sure your dog is simply responding to organic material. Reed nodded, already moving toward the exit. That makes sense. Brooks, we should probably. Max doesn't alert to soup, Reed. He's trained for narcotics, explosives, and human remains. If he's this fixated, there's a reason. Wilkins' expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I appreciate your dedication, officer, that I can't authorize property damage based on a dog's behavior. If you'd like to pursue this officially, you're welcome to obtain a warrant, though I should warn you that our legal team would likely view such action as harassment of a licensed care facility. The threat hung in the air, polite but unmistakable. Reed was already at the door, clearly ready to close this chapter and move on. But Daniel looked down at Max, at the rigid stance, the focused stare, the low vibration still rumbling from his chest, and knew with absolute certainty that walking away would be the wrong choice. "Then I'll get a warrant," Daniel said. Evelyn Carter had been standing in the medication room doorway for the past 11 minutes, her fingers wrapped so tightly around her clipboard that the edges had begun to cut into our palms. She told herself she was just monitoring the situation. That's what the head nurse was supposed to do when police arrived. But the truth sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and unmovable. She'd known about the couch for 3 years. Not at first, not when Mrs. Holloway had been admitted, frail and confused, clutching a leather purse she refused to let anyone touch. Not even when the old woman had started wandering the halls at night, whispering about letters that needed to be sent, about people who needed to know the truth. Evelyn had dismissed it as dementia, the same way she'd learned to dismiss so many things at Silver Oaks. It was easier that way, safer. But then came the night she'd found Margaret trying to pry open the couch cushions with a dinner fork, her arthritic fingers bleeding from the effort, tears streaming down her weathered face. "They took everything," Margaret had sobbed. "My Henry's letters, the deed, the locket, everything. He said nobody would ever look there. Nobody ever looks at old furniture." Evelyn had sedated her, Dr. Wilkins' orders. "She's becoming agitated and disruptive. We can't have her disturbing the other residents." The next morning, Margaret Holloway could barely remember her own daughter's name, let alone hidden letters or stolen inheritances. The medication had seen to that. And Evelyn had said nothing. Now she watched the young officer, Reed according to his nameplate, practically dragging his partner toward the exit, clearly eager to be done with this pointless distraction. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the weight of 3 years pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to buckle her knees. The German Shepherd hadn't moved. Its handler, Officer Brooks, stood beside the couch with the kind of stillness that spoke of absolute conviction. She recognized that quality. She'd seen it in doctors who refused to give up on dying patients, in family members who insisted their loved ones were still in there somewhere beneath the fog of dementia. It was the look of someone who trusted something deeper than policy or procedure. Evelyn, Dr. Wilkins appeared beside her so suddenly she nearly dropped her clipboard. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "I need you to prepare Mrs. Holloway's afternoon medications, double the usual dosage of lorazepam. She's been particularly anxious today." Evelyn's throat tightened. Margaret Holloway hadn't been anxious. She'd been sitting quietly by the window, the way she always did since they'd increased her medications, staring at nothing with empty eyes. "Doctor, I don't think—" "That wasn't a request, Nurse Carter." His smile remained professional, but his eyes were granite. "And once the officers leave, I'll need you to arrange for that couch to be moved to storage. It's time we updated the lounge furniture. I'm sure our residents would appreciate something more comfortable." The implication was clear. The couch would disappear into the facility's basement and eventually into a dumpster, along with whatever secrets it contained. Just like the incident reports that never made it to the state inspectors, just like complaints from families that somehow got lost in paperwork, just like Margaret Holloway's lucidity, chemically erased one dose at a time. Evelyn had been a nurse for 23 years. She took an oath. First, do no harm. But standing in that doorway, watching Dr. Wilkins smooth talk the police while a trained canine practically vibrated with certainty, she realized she'd been doing harm through silence for far too long. She thought about her daughter, Emma, who'd just started nursing school. Emma, who talked about her future patients with such idealism, such fierce determination to make a difference. What would Emma think if she knew her mother had become the kind of nurse who looked the other way, who chose job security over justice, who let vulnerable people be drugged into submission because it was easier than standing up to a man in an expensive cardigan? Officer Brooks was still there, his hand resting on his dog's shoulders, having some kind of silent conversation with his partner that didn't require words. Reed had paused at the door, clearly impatient but waiting. Dr. Wilkins was already turning away, confident that his authority had settled the matter. Evelyn's hand trembled as she set down her clipboard on the medication cart. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought about Margaret Holloway's bleeding fingers, about all the residents who'd been deemed too difficult or too confused and subsequently medicated into compliance. She thought about the lockbox in Dr. Wilkins' office that she wasn't supposed to know about, the one where he kept the estate management files for residents whose families rarely visited. Her legs carried her forward before her mind could construct all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. Before she could calculate everything she stood to lose, her position, her pension, the respect of colleagues who'd learned not to question the chain of command. Officer Brooks? Her voice came out stronger than she expected, cutting through the lobby's tension like a scalpel. All three men turned to look at her. There's something you should know about that couch, something about a patient named Margaret Holloway and what Dr. Wilkins doesn't want you to find. The detectives arrived 40 minutes later, but Dr. Wilkins made his move in the intervening silence. He'd retreated to his office briefly, ostensibly to gather files, and returned with the kind of predatory confidence that came from years of wielding power over the powerless. Behind him walked a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Daniel earned in a month. "Officer Brooks," the suited man announced, extending a business card that Daniel didn't take. "Martin Schaefer, legal counsel for Silver Oaks Healthcare Group. I need to inform you that you've conducted an illegal search and seizure on private property. Any evidence obtained will be inadmissible in court, and my client will be filing formal complaints with your department, the city, and pursuing civil damages for the destruction of facility property." Daniel had expected this. Men like Wilkins didn't rise to positions of authority without learning how to protect themselves. The search was conducted based on credible witness testimony and a certified canine alert. Exigent circumstances. There were no exigent circumstances, Schaefer interrupted smoothly. No immediate threat to life or safety, no hot pursuit of a fleeing suspect. You damaged private property based on the word of a dog and an employee who's clearly experiencing some kind of breakdown. He glanced dismissively at Evelyn, who flinched but held her ground. This is exactly the kind of cowboy police work that costs cities millions in settlements. Reed shifted uncomfortably beside Daniel, and Daniel could practically feel the younger officer's certainty crumbling. The legal language was having its intended effect, creating doubt, making the rightness of their actions seem suddenly murky and ill-considered. Wilkins stepped forward, his earlier panic replaced with calculated authority. "I've already spoken with Councilman Richard Barrett. He's very concerned about the treatment of Silver Oaks, particularly given that we're one of the largest employers in this district and a significant contributor to local charitable causes." He paused, letting the implicit threat settle. "The councilman has assured me he'll be speaking with Chief Morrison about this incident personally." Daniel felt the familiar weight of institutional pressure, the kind that had derailed investigations before. Barrett was the city council member who controlled the police budget, who'd made his political career on being tough on government overreach. Having him involved meant this would become political, which meant the department would be looking for ways to minimize damage rather than pursue justice. Dr. Wilkins also serves on the board of 3 other elder care facilities in the region. He's a respected member of the medical community, recipient of the Governor's Award for Healthcare Excellence in 2023. Meanwhile, you've destroyed property based on accusations from a patient with documented severe dementia and a nurse with, he consulted his notes, a history of disciplinary issues related to questioning medical protocols. Evelyn's face went white. Those weren't disciplinary issues. I filed concerns about medication practices and were counseled multiple times about exceeding your scope of practice and undermining physician authority, Schaefer said coldly. It's all documented in your personnel file, which we'll happily provide to the court. Daniel saw the trap being constructed in real time. They would discredit Evelyn, painting her as a disgruntled employee with a grunge. They would present Margaret Holloway as unreliable, her letters dismissed as the confused ramblings of a dementia patient. They would use political pressure to make the department back down, and everything would be buried under legal motions and settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Those letters, Daniel said, keeping his voice level, Mrs. Holloway detailed specific financial transactions. Those can be verified. By whom? Wilkins asked, his confidence growing. Margaret Holloway is mentally incompetent. She can't testify to anything. And even if those letters are genuine, they prove nothing except that a confused elderly woman had paranoid delusions about her finances. We manage healthcare trusts for dozens of residents whose families can't handle the burden. It's a legitimate service. Every document was properly notarized and filed with the state. Schaefer nodded. My client has cooperated with every state inspection, maintained all required documentation, and has an unblemished record with Adult Protective Services. Meanwhile, you've conducted an illegal search, traumatized vulnerable residents, and disrupted the operation of a licensed medical facility. The narrative here is very clear, Officer Brooks. Reed cleared his throat. Brooks, maybe we should wait for the detectives. Let them sort through the legal issues before this gets worse. Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Sergeant Williams. Barrett already called Morrison. Chief wants you to back off pending legal review. Do not make arrests. Secure a scene and wait for further instructions. Wilkins must have seen something change in Daniel's expression because his smile widened. I understand you were just trying to do your job, Officer Brooks. No one's questioning your intentions, but you've been misled by unreliable sources and you've overstepped your authority. The professional thing to do now would be to admit the mistake, return the items you've taken, and let my attorney and the city's legal department work out appropriate compensation for the damages. Return the letters. Daniel's voice came out harder than he'd intended. Evidence in a potential criminal case? Evidence obtained illegally, corrected Schaefer. Fruit of the poisonous tree. Any prosecutor will tell you the same thing. And frankly, officer, the longer you hold those items, the worse this looks for you. Right now, this can be resolved quietly, a reprimand maybe, some retraining. But if you continue down this path, if you arrest Dr. Wilkins or try to pursue charges based on tainted evidence, you'll be the one facing consequences. Your department won't back you. They can't afford to. Daniel looked at the letters still spread across the table, at Margaret Holloway's desperate handwriting documenting her own exploitation. He thought about how many times he'd seen cases like this collapse under the weight of legal maneuvering and political pressure, how many times justice became secondary to protecting institutions and avoiding liability. Wilkins stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost sympathetic. I know you think you're helping, Officer Brooks, but Mrs. Holloway is safe here. She's receiving excellent medical care. Those letters were written years ago, when she was far more confused than she is now. She's actually much calmer since we adjusted her medications. Why don't you go see her yourself? Talk to her. You'll see that there's nothing to investigate here. It was a challenge and a trap simultaneously. If Margaret Holloway was as heavily medicated as Evelyn suggested, she wouldn't be able to confirm or deny anything. Her confusion would be used as proof that the letters were meaningless, that this entire investigation was built on the fantasies of a damaged mind. And if Daniel pushed forward anyway, he'd be doing it alone, without departmental support, against lawyers and politicians, and the full weight of an institution designed to protect itself above all else. Evelyn Carter had been silent for the past 5 minutes, watching the attorney dismantle the case with surgical precision, watching Dr. Wilkins reconstruct his armor of respectability and political connections. She'd seen this before. Not in a legal context, but in the quieter, more insidious ways that institutions protected themselves. The incident reports that vanished, the family complaints that got lost in bureaucratic mazes, the concerned employees who suddenly found themselves written up for minor infractions until they learned to stop asking questions. She thought about her daughter Emma again, about the idealism that would curdle into cynicism if this was the kind of nursing Evelyn modeled. She thought about Margaret Holloway sitting in her room right now, chemically distant from her own memories, unaware that her letters had finally been found. She thought about the other residents, 15 that she knew of, probably more before her time, whose autonomy had been systematically stripped away and converted into profit margins. "I have documentation," Evelyn said suddenly, her voice cutting through Schaefer's continued legal monologue. "Copies of medication records, financial forms, and internal emails. I've been keeping them for 2 years." The room went still. Wilkins' face transformed from confident to something approaching panic in the space of a heartbeat. Schaefer's smooth professional demeanor cracked slightly. Even Daniel turned to stare at her. "What are you talking about?" Wilkins demanded, his voice losing its practiced calm. Evelyn pulled her phone from her scrub pocket with trembling hands. "I started making copies after Mrs. Holloway, after I realized what was happening and decided I was too much of a coward to report it. I told myself I was just documenting things, just keeping records in case I ever found the courage." Her laugh was bitter. "I've been carrying around evidence of my own complicity for 24 months, too scared to do anything with it." She opened her email application, her fingers moving with surprising steadiness now that the decision had been made. "I have scans of the consent forms residents signed for the financial trusts, forms that were presented to patients after they'd been given pre-procedural sedatives, medications that Dr. Wilkins ordered specifically before these meetings, documented right here in the MAR records, medications that aren't standard protocol for financial discussions." "Nurse Carter, you're clearly not thinking straight," Nurse Wilkins started, but Evelyn spoke over him, her voice growing stronger. "I have email exchanges between Dr. Wilkins and the facility's financial manager discussing problematic residents who require behavioral intervention. That's what they called people who questioned the trust arrangements. Within days of those emails, those same residents would have their medication orders revised. Higher doses of lorazepam, increased antipsychotics, sedatives that weren't medically necessary but were very effective at making people compliant." She turned her phone screen toward Daniel, showing him a forwarded email chain. "Here's one from 8 months ago about Mr. Chen in room 301. He told his daughter he wanted to revoke the power of attorney he'd signed. 3 days later, Dr. Wilkins ordered a psychiatric evaluation, diagnosed him with acute agitation and paranoid ideation, and started him on haloperidol. Mr. Chen stopped asking questions after that. He stopped talking much at all." Schaefer moved forward, his professional veneer cracking further. "Those are private medical records. Accessing and sharing them without authorization is a HIPAA violation. You could lose your license, face criminal charges." "I know," Evelyn said simply. "I've known that for 2 years. It's part of why I stayed quiet. But Officer Brooks is right here, witnessing me volunteer this information as part of an active investigation. I'm making a formal statement about elder abuse and financial exploitation at this facility." She scrolled through more files, her voice taking on the clinical precision she used when documenting patient care. I have records showing that 17 residents over the past 3 years have been placed on psychoactive medications within 72 hours of questioning financial arrangements. I have documentation of family members being told their loved ones were too agitated for visits immediately after those family members started asking about finances. I have copies of trust documents showing that Silver Oaks Healthcare Group receives administrative fees of 15% of all managed assets, fees that aren't disclosed to families and that create a direct financial incentive to acquire control of resident estates. Wilkins lunged forward, reaching for the phone, but Reed stepped between them with surprising speed. "Don't," the young officer said quietly, his hand moving to his belt. The skepticism was completely gone from his face now, replaced with disgust. Evelyn continued, speaking faster now as if afraid she might lose her nerve. "I documented the pattern because I kept telling myself that one day someone would investigate and I wanted to be ready to help. But really, I was just covering my own conscience, making myself feel like I wasn't completely complicit by keeping records I was too afraid to share." She looked directly at Wilkins, her eyes wet but unflinching. "You told me I was a good nurse, that questioning you was insubordination, that the residents were better off medicated because it kept them calm and safe. You made me believe that what we were doing was mercy. But Mrs. Holloway's letters—" Her voice cracked. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly what was happening to her. She was just drugged into silence. Daniel took the phone carefully, scrolling through the documentation with growing recognition of what he was seeing. This wasn't just evidence, it was a roadmap of systematic abuse spanning years. Medication records that would prove the pattern, emails that established intent, financial documents that showed motive. Combined with Margaret Holloway's letters, this was enough to build a case that could withstand legal challenges. "These records are inadmissible," Schaefer insisted, but his voice had lost his certainty. "Illegally obtained, violations of privacy laws." "I know," Evelyn said simply. "I've known that for 2 years. It's part of why I stayed quiet. But Officer Brooks is right here, witnessing me volunteer this information as part of an active investigation. I'm making a formal statement about elder abuse and financial exploitation at this facility." She scrolled through more files, her voice taking on the clinical precision she used when documenting patient care. "I have records showing that 17 residents over the past 3 years have been placed on psychoactive medications within 72 hours of questioning financial arrangements. I have documentation of family members being told their loved ones were too agitated for visits immediately after those family members started asking about finances. I have copies of trust documents showing that Silver Oaks Healthcare Group receives administrative fees of 15% of all managed assets, fees that aren't disclosed to families, and that create a direct financial incentive to acquire control of resident estates." Wilkins lunged forward, reaching for the phone, but Reed stepped between them with surprising speed. "Don't," the young officer said quietly, his hand moving to his belt. The skepticism was completely gone from his face now, replaced with disgust. Evelyn continued, speaking faster now as if afraid she might lose her nerve. "I documented the pattern because I kept telling myself that one day someone would investigate and I wanted to be ready to help. But really, I was just covering my own conscience, making myself feel like I wasn't completely complicit by keeping records I was too afraid to share." She looked directly at Wilkins, her eyes wet but unflinching. "You told me I was a good nurse, that questioning you was insubordination, that the residents were better off medicated because it kept them calm and safe. You made me believe that what we were doing was mercy. But Mrs. Holloway's letters—" Her voice cracked. She wasn't confused. She knew exactly what was happening to her. She was just drugged into silence. Daniel took the phone carefully, scrolling through the documentation with growing recognition of what he was seeing. This wasn't just evidence, it was a roadmap of systematic abuse spanning years. Medication records that would prove the pattern, emails that established intent, financial documents that showed motive. Combined with Margaret Holloway's letters, this was enough to build a case that could withstand legal challenges. "These records are inadmissible," Schaefer insisted, but his voice had lost his certainty.
Illegally obtained, violations of privacy laws. I know, Evelyn said simply. I've known that for 2 years. It's part of why I stayed quiet. But Officer Brooks is right here, witnessing me volunteer this information as part of an active investigation. I'm making a formal statement about elder abuse and financial exploitation at this facility. She scrolled through more files, her voice taking on the clinical precision she used when documenting patient care. I have records showing that 17 residents over the past 3 years have been placed on psychoactive medications within 72 hours of questioning financial arrangements. I have documentation of family members being told their loved ones were too agitated for visits immediately after those family members started asking about finances. I have copies of trust documents showing that Silver Oaks Healthcare Group receives administrative fees of 15% of all managed assets, fees that aren't disclosed to families and that create a direct financial incentive to acquire control of resident estates.
The conference room at Silver Oaks had never held this many people. Daniel counted 23 family members crammed into a space designed for maybe 15, their faces bearing expressions that ranged from confusion to mounting horror as Detective Sarah Wolf from the Financial Crimes Unit laid out what the investigation had uncovered so far. Some clutched tissues. Others sat rigid with the kind of controlled fury that came from realizing they'd been systematically deceived. Margaret Holloway's son, Robert, had flown in from Iowa that morning, his eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep or both. He sat in the front row holding the stack of letters his mother had written him, letters that had never left Silver Oaks, that had been hidden in furniture, like messages in bottles thrown into an ocean that never reached shore. His hands trembled every time he tried to read one, his lips moving silently over words his mother had written 3 years ago, begging for help that never came. "My mother wrote to me 37 times," Robert said, his voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled after Detective Wolf's presentation. 37 letters, and I thought— He couldn't finish, his shoulders shaking. A woman beside him, his sister Linda, based on the family resemblance, put her arm around him, her own face streaked with tears. "We thought she was being difficult," Linda whispered. "Dr. Wilkins told us she was experiencing paranoid delusions, that our visits were making her agitated. He said the medications would help her settle, that it was the kindest thing. We believed him because he's a doctor, because this is supposed to be a place that cares for people." Across the room, a middle-aged woman in a business suit stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "My father signed over power of attorney 6 months ago. Thomas Chen. You said he's one of the victims?" Her voice was sharp, controlled, but Daniel could hear the rage underneath. "I asked him repeatedly if he was sure, if he understood what he was signing. He kept saying it was fine, that the facility would handle everything, that I shouldn't worry. I thought—" She pressed her hand against her mouth. "I thought he was just tired of managing his own affairs. I didn't know they'd drugged him first." Detective Wolf nodded grimly. Mr. Chen was given 2 milligrams of lorazepam approximately 90 minutes before signing the power of attorney documents. According to Nurse Carter's records, that wasn't medically indicated. It was ordered specifically for the meeting with the facility's financial manager. "That's chemical coercion," someone said from the back. "That's not consent. That's not legal." "No," Wolf agreed, "it's not." The questions came in waves after that, each family member trying to understand how this had happened to their loved ones, how they'd missed the signs, how the system designed to protect vulnerable elderly people had been weaponized against them. A woman asked about her mother's sudden behavioral issues that had started right after she'd questioned a billing statement. A man wanted to know if his father's rapid cognitive decline had been real or medication-induced. Another family demanded to see the trust documents their grandmother had supposedly signed, documents they'd never been shown. Daniel stood against the back wall beside Evelyn, who'd been subpoenaed to attend despite her attorney's objections. She watched the families with a profound grief, occasionally wiping at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. When Robert Holloway looked back at her, really looked at her, his face a mask of anguish and accusation, she flinched but didn't look away. "You knew," Robert said, his voice carrying across the room. The other conversations died. "You knew my mother was trying to reach me. You read those letters, didn't you, when you found her trying to hide them?" Evelyn's throat worked, but no sound came out at first. Finally, she managed, "Yes, I knew." "Why didn't you help her?" It wasn't shouted. It was worse, quiet, bewildered, genuinely trying to understand. "Why didn't you just mail one letter? Just one?" "I was afraid. I was afraid of losing my job, my license. I was afraid no one would believe a doctor over a nurse. I was afraid of all the wrong things, and your mother paid the price for my cowardice. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I'm so, so sorry." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Margaret stood, walked across the room, and stopped directly in front of her. For a moment, Daniel thought she might strike her. Instead, she said, "But you spoke up eventually. You gave the police the evidence they needed. If you hadn't, we'd never have known. My mother would have died thinking we'd abandoned her, and we'd never have understood why." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. Mr. Chen's daughter raised her hands like she was in a classroom. "What happens now? To Dr. Wilkins, to the facility, to the money that was stolen?" Detective Wolf exchanged glances with the assistant district attorney who'd been sitting quietly in the corner. "Dr. Wilkins has been arrested and charged with 15 counts of financial exploitation of an elderly person, 8 counts of obtaining consent through chemical coercion, and multiple HIPAA violations related to sharing resident information with non-medical financial personnel." "And our parents, the ones who are still alive? What about their medications, their care?" "The state has placed Silver Oaks under emergency oversight. A team of independent physicians is reviewing every resident's medication regimen and care plan. Several residents have already had their medications reduced or eliminated where they weren't medically necessary. Some are already showing improved cognitive function." Robert Holloway looked up sharply. "My mother? Can she?" "Your mother's antipsychotic and sedative medications have been discontinued as of yesterday morning. According to the new medical team, there was never a clinical justification for them. She's been asking for you." Robert stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. "I need to see her, right now, please." Daniel watched as families began standing, asking to see their loved ones, demanding access to medical records and financial statements, forming small clusters of shared grief and rage. The silence had been broken, and with it the machinery of justice, imperfect, slow, but finally moving, had begun to turn. 3 weeks after the discovery, Daniel returned to Silver Oaks with Max for what he told himself would be the last time. The facility looked different now, not physically, but in the way institutions look when their veneer of legitimacy has been stripped away. The state oversight team had installed new signage about resident rights. A hotline number for reporting abuse was posted in every hallway. The staff moved differently too, with the nervous awareness of people working under scrutiny, knowing that every decision would be documented and reviewed. Max trotted beside him through the familiar corridors, but without the tension that had defined their first visit. The couch was gone, replaced by nothing, just an empty space against the wall that no one seemed eager to fill. Some absences, Daniel had learned, were meant to remain visible. Margaret Holloway sat in the activity room near the window where Evelyn had said she spent most of her days. But she wasn't staring blankly anymore. Her son Robert sat beside her, holding her hand, and they were looking at photographs spread across a small table, old pictures of a life that dementia and chemical sedation had tried to erase but hadn't quite managed to destroy. "Officer Brooks," Margaret said as Daniel approached, her voice thin but clear. Her eyes, no longer dulled by unnecessary medications, tracked his movement with sharp awareness. "Robert told me what you did, what your dog did." Daniel gestured to Max, who sat immediately, his tail sweeping the floor in a slow wag. "Max deserves the credit, ma'am. I just listened to him." "Not many people listen anymore," Margaret said softly. She reached out a trembling hand, and Max moved forward, resting his chin gently on her knee. Her fingers stroked his fur with the automatic affection of someone who'd once had dogs of her own. "I tried to tell everyone. I wrote it all down, hid it away like Henry taught me. But when no one came, when the pills made me forget why I was even upset, I thought maybe I really was crazy. Maybe I'd imagined everything." "You didn't imagine anything. You were right about all of it. We should have listened. We should have—" His voice broke. Margaret patted his hand with the patience of a mother who'd comforted this man through every failure of his life. "You couldn't have known, sweetheart. They were very good at making me seem unreliable." Daniel pulled up a chair, sitting so he was at eye level with her. "Mrs. Holloway, I wanted you to know that the district attorney is building a strong case. Between your letters, Nurse Carter's documentation, and the forensic accounting, they're confident about prosecution. Dr. Wilkins will face justice." "Justice?" Margaret repeated, testing the word. "I used to think justice meant punishment, prison time, fines, consequences." She looked down at Max, still resting against her leg. "But I'm 83 years old, Officer Brooks. I don't have many years left, and what I've learned these past weeks is that justice isn't just about punishing the wicked, it's about restoring what was stolen." She gestured to the photographs on the table. "My son has been coming every day. We've been going through old albums, remembering things together. My daughter visits in the evenings. They've moved me to a different facility, a good one, where the staff actually seem to care. The money that was stolen is being returned, slowly, through legal channels. But more than that," her voice trembled, "more than that, I have my mind back. I can think clearly. I can remember Henry without the memories slipping away before I can hold on to them. That's justice, too." Robert wiped his eyes. "The new doctors say she might have years of good cognitive function left, years we almost lost because of the medications Wilkins had her on." Daniel felt something tight in his chest ease slightly. He'd worked dozens of cases where the evidence was solid, the arrests clean, the prosecutions successful, but the victims remained destroyed. Addicts who'd overdosed before the drug dealers were caught, abuse victims who couldn't escape the trauma even after their abusers were imprisoned, children who'd been recovered but never quite recovered. This was different. This was restoration, not just retribution. Max shifted, moving from Margaret to explore the activity room. He sniffed the empty space where the couch had been, circled it once, then returned to Daniel's side and lay down with a heavy sigh. The search was over, the mission complete. "He knew," Margaret said, watching the dog settle. "Somehow he knew my letters were there. He knew I needed someone to find them." Canines are trained to detect scents, the leather, the old paper, maybe even traces of your scent from when you hid them. But he paused, stroking Max's head. "I've worked with Max for 6 years. I've seen him alert to drugs, weapons, human remains, but I've never seen him react the way he did to that couch. It wasn't just detection, it was insistence, like he understood what was at stake." "Maybe he did," said Robert quietly. "Maybe some things can't be explained by training or scent detection. Maybe some injustices are so profound that even animals can sense them. Daniel didn't believe in mysticism, in cosmic justice, or divine intervention. He believed in evidence and procedure and the hard work of building cases that would hold up in court. But sitting there, watching Max rest peacefully for the first time since they'd entered Silver Oaks 3 weeks ago, he thought maybe there was something to be said for instinct that transcended training, for the kind of knowing that came not from the brain, but from somewhere deeper. I spent my whole career trusting facts, reports, forensics, witness statements, things I could document and prove. But Max trusted something else that day. And if I'd ignored him, if I'd listened to everyone telling me it was just a dog being distracted, then my mother's letters would be in a landfill right now, and Dr. Wilkins would still be sedating residents who asked too many questions. Margaret reached out and took Daniel's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. You trusted your partner when everyone told you not to. That took courage. More courage than I had, hiding letters instead of screaming until someone listened. You did what you could with what you had, and it was enough. Max found them. The truth came out. Because you let him do his job, Margaret insisted, even when it cost you. Nurse Carter told me about the complaints, the pressure from the city council, the threats to your career. Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. The department ultimately backed him once the evidence became undeniable, but there were tense weeks when his actions were under review, when he'd come very close to suspension or worse. I did what needed to be done. That's what heroes say, Margaret said with a slight smile, right before they try to convince everyone they're not heroes at all. Max lifted his head, looking at Daniel with what could only be described as contentment. His tail thumped once against the floor. Outside the window, the sun was setting, casting long golden light across the activity room, so different from the skeletal shadows of their first visit. Daniel stood, preparing to leave, knowing that his work here was finished. The detectives would handle the ongoing investigation, the prosecutors would build their case, the families would pursue restitution and healing. His role, and Max's, had been to break open the silence, to refuse to accept the official narrative when every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Holloway, and thank you for being brave enough to write those letters, for not giving up even when it seemed hopeless. Thank you for being brave enough to believe them. As Daniel and Max walked back through the corridors toward the exit, he thought about all the cases that had haunted him over the years, the ones where he'd arrived too late, where the evidence had been destroyed, where justice remained forever out of reach. This wasn't one of those cases. This was something rarer, a case where listening to the right instinct at the right moment had actually saved lives that were still being lived. Max shifted, moving through the double doors ahead of him, tail wagging, ready for whatever came next. And Daniel followed, finally understanding that the best police work wasn't always the kind that looked good in reports or followed procedure perfectly. Sometimes it was just trusting your partner even when your partner had 4 legs and couldn't explain in words why something mattered. Sometimes the heart solved crimes that the law alone never could.